Success doesn't die in a car crash. It doesn't get struck by lightning. It dies quietly, in the dark, while you're sleeping. It slips away in the moments you're not paying attention, stolen by forces so subtle you don't even notice them, until years have passed and you're left wondering what happened to all those dreams you once had. Think about that goal you set for yourself 5 years ago, that business you were going to start, that book you were going to write, that skill you were going to master. Where is it now? If you're like most people, it's gathering dust in the corner of your mind, buried under a mountain of excuses that seemed reasonable at the time. There's a man I need to tell you about. His name was Anatol Marchenko, and 15 years ago, he was the most talented architect in his firm. Everyone knew it. His designs had this quality that made buildings feel alive, like they were breathing with the city around them. Partners would stop by his desk just to see what he was working on. Clients specifically requested him for their projects. He had that rare combination of technical brilliance and artistic vision that comes along maybe once in a generation. The senior partners approached him in the spring of 2009. They wanted him to lead the bid for the Gateway Complex, a mixed-use development that would become the centerpiece of the city's downtown revitalization. It was the kind of project architects dream about their entire careers. 23 acres, a budget that would give him complete creative freedom. His name would be attached to something that would stand for 100 years. They gave him 6 months to prepare his portfolio and presentation. 6 months to compile his best work, to create renderings, to develop his vision for the project. Anatol said yes immediately. He went home that night and told his wife they'd finally made it. This was the breakthrough moment they'd been waiting for. Then something interesting happened. Nothing, Anatol, had 6 months, which felt like an eternity. He'd start working on the portfolio, then think about how much time he still had. He'd sketch out ideas for the Gateway Complex, then convince himself he'd refine them next week when he had more energy. There was always tomorrow, always next week, always plenty of time. 4 months passed. Anatol had attended 12 committee meetings about the project. He'd had coffee with 3 of the partners to discuss vision alignment. He'd reorganized his previous project files twice. He'd even purchased new presentation software and spent 2 weeks learning its features. But his portfolio remained unfinished. His renderings for Gateway remained rough sketches. His presentation existed only as bullet points in a document he kept meaning to flesh out. With 2 months remaining, Anatol felt the first whisper of panic. He started staying late at the office, but somehow the work still didn't get done. He'd sit at his computer, open the files, then find himself reading architecture journals instead, researching, preparing to prepare. He'd tell himself he was doing important background work, building the foundation for something extraordinary. In reality, he was hiding from the actual task. 6 weeks before the deadline, something happened that Anatol never saw coming. Malcolm Zhang, a junior architect who joined the firm only 3 years earlier, walked into the senior partner's office with his own portfolio. Malcolm had heard about the Gateway project through office gossip. Nobody had asked him to prepare anything. Nobody had given him permission. He simply decided he wanted that project badly enough to do the work anyway. Malcolm's portfolio wasn't as polished as Anatol's would have been. His designs didn't have that same breathtaking quality. But they were complete. They were there. They existed in the real world rather than in the realm of intention and potential. The partners looked at Malcolm's work, looked at each other, and made a decision that changed 2 careers forever. When Anatol finally completed his portfolio 2 weeks after the original deadline, the decision had already been made. Malcolm Zhang was lead architect on the Gateway Complex. Anatol Marchenko remained exactly where he'd been, except now he had to watch someone else build the legacy that should have been his. The building stands downtown today, Malcolm's name carved into the cornerstone. Anatol left the firm 18 months later. Last I heard, he's doing residential remodels in the suburbs. This is how the first silent killer operates. Procrastination doesn't announce itself. It doesn't feel like failure in the moment. It feels reasonable. It feels like wisdom, even. Why rush when you have time? Why stress when you can do it tomorrow? The lie is so seductive because it contains a grain of truth. You do have time. You can do it tomorrow. But tomorrow has a way of becoming next week, and next week has a way of becoming never. Now let me tell you about Arpina Khachaturian, because her story illuminates something equally devastating. Arpina was a violinist, classically trained from age 5. By her early 20s, she'd already performed in regional orchestras across 3 states. When she played, something magical happened. The instrument became an extension of her soul. People would sit in concert halls with tears streaming down their faces, moved by something they couldn't quite name. The National Philharmonic held auditions every 3 years. It was the orchestra, the one every classical musician dreams about. The waiting list for auditions was 2 years long. Arpina had the talent. Everyone knew it. Her instructors told her she was ready. Her fellow musicians encouraged her to apply. The application sat on her kitchen table for 8 months. Every time Arpina looked at that application, her stomach tightened. What if she wasn't good enough? What if the audition panel didn't appreciate her style? What if she froze under pressure? What if she embarrassed herself in front of the most respected musicians in the country? The questions multiplied like cancer cells, each one feeding the next, until the weight of her own fear became unbearable. She never submitted the application. 3 years passed. The next audition cycle came around. The application sat on her kitchen table again. Same fear, same questions, same paralysis. This pattern continued for 12 years. 4 complete audition cycles. 4 opportunities that Arpina let slip away because the possibility of failure felt more real than the possibility of success. When Arpina finally decided she was ready to face her fear, she was 38 years old. She submitted her application with hands that shook so badly she could barely hold the pen. She practiced 8 hours a day for 6 months. She prepared like her life depended on it, because in a way, it did. She walked into that audition hall with her violin and 15 years of regret. They thanked her for her time. They said her technique was impressive. They said they'd be in touch. What they didn't say was that they were looking for emerging talent, fresh voices, musicians who would grow with the orchestra over decades. At 38, Arpina wasn't emerging. She was arrived. And she'd arrived too late. Here's something most people never realize until it's far too late. The conversation happening inside your head right now is either building your future or destroying it. Every single day, you're either talking yourself into greatness or talking yourself out of it. Most people spend their entire lives as their own worst enemy, and they don't even know it's happening. Alan Whitmore understood sales better than anyone I've ever met. He could read a room within 30 seconds. He knew which questions to ask, when to listen, when to speak. His product knowledge was encyclopedic. He'd spent 5 years studying every aspect of the industrial equipment his company manufactured. On paper, Alan should have been the top performer in his region. Instead, he was stuck in the middle of the pack, watching colleagues with half his knowledge outsell him month after month. The problem wasn't his preparation. The problem started about 15 minutes before every major presentation. Alan would sit in his car in the client's parking lot, and a voice would start whispering. It told him the decision makers had probably already chosen a competitor. It reminded him of the presentation he'd fumbled 2 months ago. It suggested that his tie didn't look quite right, that his handshake might be too firm or too weak, that his opening line sounded rehearsed even though he'd practiced it to sound natural. By the time Alan walked into those conference rooms, he'd already lost. His shoulders were slightly hunched. His voice had lost its natural confidence. He'd second-guess himself mid-sentence, creating awkward pauses that made clients uncomfortable. When they asked challenging questions, instead of responding with the authority his knowledge justified, he'd hedge. He'd use phrases like "I think" and "maybe" and "possibly." His internal dialogue had become a self-fulfilling prophecy of mediocrity. This continued for 3 years. 3 years of watching inferior salespeople close deals that should have been his. 3 years of quarterly reviews where his manager would say the same thing. "Alan, you know your stuff. I don't understand why it's not translating to results." Alan didn't understand either. He couldn't see that the enemy wasn't the competition. The enemy was the voice in his own head. Everything changed during a sales conference in Phoenix. Alan was having drinks with Foster Chen, a veteran salesperson from the Western Division. Foster had watched Alan's practice presentation earlier that day. After a few beers, Foster leaned across the table and said something that seemed almost too simple to matter. "Alan, do you know what you say to yourself before presentations? Because I can hear it in your delivery, and it's killing you." Nobody had ever pointed this out before. Alan started paying attention to his internal monologue, actually listening to it like it was another person speaking. What he discovered horrified him. The voice was relentless. It never encouraged. It never supported. It only criticized, only doubted, only predicted failure. He'd been living with an abusive roommate inside his own skull for his entire career. Alan made a decision that week. He started treating that negative voice like a hostile witness in a courtroom. Every time it made a claim, he demanded evidence. "You're going to mess this up" became "based on what?" "I've closed 43 deals in the past 2 years." "They won't like you" became "I've received positive feedback from 70% of my clients." "You don't deserve" this sale became "I've earned this through 5 years of dedicated preparation." Within 6 months, Alan Whitmore went from middle of the pack to the number 2 salesperson in his region. Within a year, he was number 1. The same knowledge, the same products, the same clients. The only thing that changed was the conversation inside his head. He'd finally stopped being his own saboteur. But there's another killer that's even more insidious because it disguises itself as success. Clarissa Beaumont discovered this the hard way. In 2007, Clarissa opened a French bistro in a neighborhood that was just beginning to gentrify. Her timing was perfect. Her cassoulet was legendary. Her wine selection was impeccable. Within 2 years, food critics were writing glowing reviews. Within 4 years, you needed reservations 3 weeks in advance. Clarissa had found her formula, and it worked beautifully. Intimate setting. Classic French cuisine. Exceptional service. No gimmicks. No trends. Just timeless excellence. Revenue grew steadily. Her staff was loyal. Her regulars became like family. She'd created exactly what she'd dreamed of creating. Life was comfortable. Life was predictable. Life was good. Then the neighborhood continued to change. Younger people moved in. Tech companies opened offices nearby. The demographics shifted. Other restaurants opened with different concepts: farm to table spots, fusion cuisine, interactive dining experiences. Clarissa watched these newcomers with a mixture of amusement and disdain. Fads, she thought. Trends that would pass. Her classical approach would endure because quality always endures. Her regulars started coming less frequently. They still loved her food, but they were exploring the new options. Younger diners would walk past her bistro, glance at the menu in the window, and continue to the hipper places down the street. Clarissa told herself she didn't want those customers anyway. She wanted people who appreciated real cuisine, not Instagram backdrops. Revenue started declining in 2014. Slowly at first. 5%, then 8%, then 15%. Clarissa responded by doubling down on what had always worked. She made her menu even more traditional. She kept her prices steady, refusing to discount. She maintained her formal service style. She stayed in her comfort zone because her comfort zone had always been successful. By 2017, the bistro was losing money every month. Clarissa had taken out a second mortgage on her home to keep the doors open. Her loyal staff had dwindled from 12 to 4. The dining room that once required advance reservations now sat half-empty most nights. Still, she resisted change. She'd built something beautiful, something that worked, and she couldn't understand why the world had stopped appreciating it. The bistro closed in early 2018. Clarissa stood in the empty dining room on the final night, surrounded by 20 years of memories, and finally understood what had happened. The market hadn't rejected her. She'd rejected the market. She'd confused consistency with stagnation. She'd mistaken stubbornness for integrity. She'd loved her comfort zone more than she loved her dream, and her comfort zone had become a cage. 6 months after closing, Clarissa was having coffee with a former regular who'd become a friend. He asked her what she'd do differently if she could go back. Clarissa didn't hesitate. "I'd have been brave enough to evolve. I'd have kept what made us special but adapted to what people needed. I'd have understood that staying the same in a changing world isn't preservation. It's just slow-motion surrender." These two killers work in tandem. Your negative self-talk convinces you that change is dangerous, that you're not capable of growth, that stepping outside your comfort zone will lead to disaster. Then your comfort zone becomes a prison, and you watch opportunities pass by while telling yourself that staying put is the smart choice. Together, they create a life of diminishing returns disguised as stability. The people surrounding you right now are either lifting you toward your potential or dragging you away from it. There's no neutral ground in relationships. Every conversation either adds to your life or subtracts from it. Every person in your inner circle is either an investor in your dreams or a creditor collecting interest on your doubts. Gregory Walsh learned this truth in the most painful way possible. In 2011, Gregory and his college roommate, Philip, launched a software company designed to streamline inventory management for small retail businesses. Gregory was the visionary, the one who saw possibilities everywhere. Philip was the realist, the one who, as he liked to say, kept Gregory's head out of the clouds. They seemed like the perfect partnership: complementary skills, shared history, total trust. The first 2 years were brutal but exhilarating. They worked from Gregory's basement. They ate ramen noodles for dinner 4 nights a week. They pitched their software to anyone who would listen. Slowly, painfully, they gained traction. 20 clients became 50. 50 became 100. By year 3, they'd moved into a real office and hired their first 2 employees. Revenue hit 7 figures. Gregory could feel momentum building. They were on the verge of something significant. That's when Philip's true nature began revealing itself. During strategy meetings, Philip would shoot down Gregory's expansion ideas before they were fully explained. When Gregory proposed developing a mobile version of their software, Philip called it premature. When Gregory wanted to hire a marketing firm, Philip said they couldn't afford it. When Gregory suggested they apply for a business development grant, Philip said the paperwork wasn't worth the effort. Every suggestion met the same response: too risky, too expensive, too ambitious, too soon. Gregory told himself Philip was being prudent. After all, someone needed to pump the brakes, right? Someone needed to be the voice of caution. But Philip wasn't cautious. Philip was scared. More than that, Philip was threatened. Every time Gregory proposed something bold, Philip saw his own limitations being exposed. Rather than rise to meet Gregory's vision, Philip worked systematically to reduce Gregory to his own level. The pattern intensified. In meetings with potential investors, Philip would undermine Gregory's projections. Gregory tends to be optimistic, he'd say with a condescending smile. But here are the realistic numbers. When their team brought forward innovative ideas, Philip would dismiss them before Gregory could respond. When competitors launched features they should have developed months earlier, Philip would explain why being first wasn't important. He'd become a wet blanket thrown over every spark of possibility. Gregory's health started deteriorating. He developed tension, headaches that lasted for days. His sleep became fractured. He'd wake at 3 in the morning with his mind racing, trying to figure out how to navigate Philip's resistance. He gained 30 pounds in 8 months. His wife barely recognized him anymore. The joy that had driven him to build this company was being suffocated under the weight of Philip's negativity. The breaking point came during a board meeting in 2015. Gregory had secured a meeting with a venture capital firm interested in providing growth funding. It would allow them to scale nationally, to compete with the major players, to become what Gregory had always envisioned. Philip spent the entire presentation contradicting Gregory's statements, highlighting potential problems, emphasizing risks. The investors passed. After they left, Philip actually seemed relieved. Gregory sat in his car that night and realized something that had been obvious to everyone else for years. Philip didn't want the company to succeed beyond a certain point. He was comfortable with their current size. He liked being a big fish in a small pond. Gregory's ambition terrified him because it threatened his comfort. Philip wasn't Gregory's partner. He was an anchor disguised as a co-pilot. The decision to buy out Philip's share nearly bankrupted Gregory personally. It took 18 months of negotiations, legal fees, and emotional warfare. Philip fought it at every stage, trying to extract maximum value while simultaneously claiming the company had no real potential. By the time the papers were signed, Gregory had lost weight, friends, and a significant portion of his savings. But he'd gained something infinitely more valuable. He'd gained his freedom. Within 2 years of Philip's departure, the company tripled in size. They launched the mobile platform Philip had opposed. They hired the marketing firm Philip had called unnecessary. They secured the venture funding Philip had sabotaged. Gregory built the exact company he'd envisioned from the beginning, the one Philip had spent years preventing. Looking back, Gregory calculated that Philip's negativity had cost them approximately 4 years of growth and millions in lost revenue. But here's what most people miss. The damage toxic relationships cause isn't just about missed opportunities. It's about who you become while you're in them. Gregory had started second-guessing his own instincts. He'd stopped trusting his vision. He'd begun to internalize Philip's limitations as his own. When he finally broke free, he had to rebuild not just his business but his belief in himself. Yet there's a killer that operates even more quietly than toxic relationships. This one doesn't announce itself through conflict or negativity. It kills through absence, through vagueness, through the comfortable fog of moving without direction. Isabel Durant spent 15 years as a marketing executive at a pharmaceutical company. She was good at her job, She received consistent promotions. Her salary increased steadily. Her colleagues respected her. Her performance reviews glowed with praise. By every external measure, Isabel was successful. Her parents were proud. Her friends envied her stability. She had the career people are supposed to want. Except Isabel couldn't shake a feeling that something was wrong. She'd arrive at her desk each morning with a vague sense of unease she couldn't name. She'd sit through meetings and wonder why nothing felt important. She'd complete projects that took months of effort and feel absolutely nothing when they launched. Success felt empty. Achievement felt hollow. She was winning a game she'd never agreed to play. The realization came during her daughter's 8th birthday party. Isabel was sitting on the back deck, watching the kids play in the yard, when her daughter ran over and asked what Mommy did at work. Isabel opened her mouth to answer and discovered she couldn't explain it in a way that sounded meaningful. She developed marketing strategies for pharmaceutical products. She optimized brand positioning. She coordinated with sales teams to maximize market penetration. The words came out, but they sounded like someone else's life. That night, Isabel pulled out a journal she'd kept during college. Page after page described her dreams of working in environmental conservation. She'd wanted to protect endangered ecosystems. She'd wanted to fight climate change. She'd wanted to leave the world better than she'd found it. She'd been passionate, specific, and absolutely certain about her purpose. Then she'd graduated into a recession. Environmental nonprofits weren't hiring. Her student loans demanded payment. A pharmaceutical company offered a good salary and benefits. She'd told herself it was temporary, just until she got on her feet. Temporary became permanent through 1,000 small compromises she'd barely noticed making. 15 years had vanished, not spent poorly, not wasted on addiction or laziness, simply poured into goals she'd never consciously chosen. She'd climbed a ladder efficiently and effectively, and when she reached the top, she'd discovered it was leaning against the wrong building. The transition wasn't easy. Isabel took a 60% pay cut to join a conservation organization. Her friends thought she'd lost her mind. Her parents worried about her financial security. Her former colleagues assumed she was having a midlife crisis. Maybe she was. But here's what they didn't understand. Isabel had spent 15 years achieving someone else's definition of success. She'd hit targets that meant nothing to her soul. She'd won awards in competitions she never entered willingly. 3 years later, Isabel leads a team working to restore coastal wetlands. She makes less money. She has less prestige. Her office is smaller. Her title is less impressive. And she's never been happier. Because now when her daughter asks what Mommy does at work, Isabel can answer with purpose, with passion, with a clear sense that her days matter. These two destroyers feed each other. When you lack clear goals, you become vulnerable to anyone with an agenda for your life. Toxic people fill your direction vacuum with their limitations. Without knowing where you're going, you can't recognize when someone's steering you off course. Direction protects you. Purpose acts as a filter. When you know exactly what you're building, it becomes obvious who's helping and who's hindering. There's one killer that sits above all the others. One force that, when left unchecked, guarantees everything else will eventually crumble. It's the refusal to learn. The decision that you've already arrived. The belief that what got you here will automatically get you where you need to go. William Brennan ran the Thompson manufacturing plant for 23 years. When he took over in 1991, the factory employed 340 workers producing precision components for the automotive industry. William knew that factory floor like he knew his own heartbeat. He'd started as a line supervisor, worked his way up through operations, and finally earned the plant manager position through sheer competence and dedication. His methods were proven. His systems were efficient. His quality control standards were legendary. Orders shipped on time. Defect rates stayed below 1%. The corporate office left him alone because the numbers always looked good. William had mastered his craft, and he saw no reason to change what worked. The industry began shifting in the early 2000s. Automation technologies were advancing rapidly. Computer-aided manufacturing was becoming standard. Competitors were implementing lean production systems and just-in-time inventory methods. Corporate sent William to seminars. They offered to fund equipment upgrades. They suggested he bring in consultants to evaluate modernization opportunities. William attended the seminars and dismissed what he heard as theoretical nonsense from people who'd never run a real factory. He looked at the equipment proposals and saw unnecessary expenses. He met with the consultants and spent the entire time explaining why their recommendations wouldn't work in his plant. His factory had operated successfully for decades. These new approaches were untested fads that would fade away once people remembered that fundamentals matter more than flashy technology. His workforce began aging. Younger workers didn't want to learn the manual processes William insisted on maintaining. They'd ask about training on newer equipment, and he'd tell them to master the basics first. Talented employees would leave for competitors offering more modern work environments. William would shrug and say good riddance to people who didn't appreciate traditional craftsmanship. Orders started declining in 2008. Some clients moved to competitors with faster turnaround times. Others needed components his equipment couldn't produce to the required tolerances. William blamed the recession. He blamed unfair foreign competition. He blamed corporate for not providing enough marketing support. He blamed everything except the real problem. His factory was becoming obsolete because he'd refused to evolve. Corporate gave him one final chance in 2012. They allocated $2 million for a complete modernization of his production line. They brought in implementation teams. They offered retraining programs for his workforce. All William had to do was embrace the change and lead his people through it. He fought it every step of the way. He argued that his workers were too old to learn new systems. He insisted the new equipment was overcomplicated. He predicted the implementation would be a disaster. When problems inevitably arose during the transition, William pointed to them as proof he'd been right all along, never acknowledging that his resistance was causing most of the difficulties. The plant closed in 2014. 340 families lost their primary income, a building that had been the economic heartbeat of a small town. For 60 years went dark. William retired with his pension intact, but he had to live with the knowledge that his stubbornness had cost hundreds of people their livelihoods. The final report from corporate was devastating in its simplicity. The Thompson plant failed not because of market forces or competitive pressure, but because management refused to adapt to changing industry standards. Here's what connects all 7 of these killers. They're all choices. Procrastination is choosing comfort over action. Fear is choosing safety over possibility. Negative self-talk is choosing to believe the worst version of your story. Comfort zone addiction is choosing the familiar over the necessary. Toxic relationships are choosing to keep people who diminish you. Lack of goals is choosing to drift instead of direct. Refusal to learn is choosing your ego over your growth. Every single day, you're making these choices. Most of the time, you're making them unconsciously. The choices feel small. Putting off that important call feels like nothing. Staying quiet in the meeting feels like prudence. Keeping that friendship that drains you feels like loyalty. Doing things the way you've always done them feels like consistency. Each individual choice seems insignificant, but choices compound. Small decisions made consistently over months and years become the architecture of your entire life. Anatole lost his dream project because he chose tomorrow over today until tomorrow never came. Arpina lost her chance at the orchestra because she chose fear over courage until courage no longer mattered. Alan nearly destroyed his career because he chose to believe the voice of doubt over the evidence of his competence. Clarissa lost her restaurant because she chose the comfort of what worked yesterday over the demands of what was needed today. Gregory almost lost his company because he chose loyalty to a toxic partnership over commitment to his vision. Isabel lost 15 years because she chose someone else's path over her own purpose. William destroyed an entire factory because he chose his pride over his responsibility to grow. But here's the truth that changes everything. These killers only win when you don't see them. Once you recognize them, once you name them, once you understand how they operate, you can fight back. Not someday, not when conditions are perfect. Right now, today, this moment. Stop negotiating with procrastination. Stop waiting for fear to give you permission. Stop believing the critic inside your head that's been wrong about you your entire life. Stop confusing your comfort zone with your home. Stop protecting relationships that are poisoning your future. Stop moving without knowing where you're going. Stop pretending that what you knew yesterday will be enough for tomorrow. Your life is happening right now. Not in some future moment when everything aligns perfectly. Not after you've figured everything out. Not when you feel ready. The person you're capable of becoming is waiting on the other side of the decisions you've been avoiding. The success you deserve is being held hostage by the silent killers you've been tolerating. These forces respect only one thing: decisive action backed by unwavering commitment to your highest potential and deepest purpose. The question isn't whether you have what it takes. The question is whether you're willing to stop letting these 7 forces steal your potential one quiet day at a time. Everything you want is available to you. Everything you're capable of achieving is within reach. The only thing standing between you and the life you're meant to live is your willingness to recognize these killers for what they are and make the choice to defeat them. That choice is yours. Nobody else can make it for you. And the time to make it isn't someday. The time is now.